Okay. Well, I'll just leave then.
Okay.
Hope the
Thanks.
seminar goes well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. So afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Jack. I'm one of the co-directors of the Otago Energy Research Centre. So welcome to our seminar series. This is the third talk in our series focusing on, I guess, COVID-19 disruption and new energy futures. So the idea behind this series is really to sit back and I guess things changed quite significantly during COVID-19. Our normal lives changed quite significantly, and that also had a big effect on the energy systems in New Zealand. And so the idea behind this series was really to ask a number of experts whether their thinking had changed after COVID, after that lockdown in COVID-19. Of course, we can't really call it post COVID-19 because people are still being affected very much by COVID-19. But we wanted these experts to reflect on the lockdown that we've had in New Zealand and see if they had new thoughts on what the energy transition might look like. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Higham. So he's a professor in the Dept of Tourism in the School of Business at the University of Otago. He's has interests in diverse areas of sustainability, and his current research is focused on the decarbonisation of tourism, with a particular focus on transportation. And he's a member of the Transport Research Network, which is now a University of Otago theme. So James will provide insights into well, I'll let you introduce what you're going to talk about, James. So please take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, everyone. It's nice to be here in my own office. Bizarrely, I have presented seminars to the OERC before, but never like this. So it's quite novel and it's fun. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about a paper that we published recently, and I'll mention straight away that this work was led by colleagues at the University of Oxford. Milan is a PhD student in physics, Debbie and Miles in the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford, and this paper actually predates COVID-19. I'm wondering why I can't move my presentation to the next slide. Excuse me. There we go. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Yeah, so thank you. This paper predates COVID. It analyzes a conference, the World Geophysical Union's fall meeting in December 2019, hosted in San Francisco. The analysis was performed late 2019, early 2020 by Milan, and so the paper actually predates COVID, but the relevance of the paper became very much heightened by the COVID pandemic. Michael was mentioning a minute ago about how things have changed and how we may have changed the way we think and act due to COVID. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to try and keep it reasonably short so we can maximize time for discussions. I'm particularly interested in discussions and questions that might arise from this analysis, and very keen to hear what people think about what we're putting forward here. But right at the end of my presentation, in the final slide, I'm going to show you a slide that really addresses Michael's purpose for the seminar series, in my view, very, very nicely. So we know the context around high carbon transportation and high dependency on high carbon transport modes in the pre-COVID past normal are increasing and rapidly growing demand for high-speed, long-haul air travel, and the fact that we're all acutely conscious of the carbon emissions arising therefrom, and that we've failed individually, collectively, I guess, globally, to meaningfully respond to the challenge of mitigating CO2 from aviation. Academics prior to COVID were obviously a part of this group of quite frequent flyers. I've read all sorts of statistics from different countries around the enormous inequities associated with air travel. As an example, the UK, 15% of the population is responsible for 70% of flights, and academics are certainly part of that hypermobile minority of very highly aeromobile travellers, despite our awareness of the environmental externalities of air travel. So, as I've mentioned, our focus fell upon the AGU, the world's largest Earth and Space Science conference. 28,000 people attended this meeting in December 2019 in San Francisco, and between them, they accounted for 285 million kilometers of transportation, twice the distance from the Earth to the Sun, producing obviously an enormous carbon footprint. So we conducted an analysis of air travel associated with AGU and gave consideration to how we might significantly reduce those conference travel emissions. So the analysis obviously is outlined in the paper, but we assumed typical modes of travel based on distance, and typically travel of more than 400 kilometers is likely to involve air travel. That was 92% of those conference delegates. The remaining 8% we assumed that they traveled by surface. 75% of total emissions were accounted for by people taking intercontinental flights, those being over 8,000 kilometers of distance traveled, and 39% of emissions were produced by 17% of delegates who had traveled the greatest distances, and those were delegates from India, China, and our part of the world. So here's a chart that outlines the travel distances that were required for delegates to arrive to attend the conference in San Francisco. And you can see that obviously a lot of delegates traveled from within that 4,000 kilometer radius from North America, but obviously very large bodies of conference delegates traveling from Europe and Asia and further afield as well. So this gives a graphical insight into just how far people traveled to attend the conference in San Francisco. At the other end of the spectrum, 2% of emissions were generated by 22% of delegates, and those were people who obviously traveled less distance, and those were people who traveled less than 1,500 kilometers. So these are the kind of short, medium haul conference delegates. Milan's analysis calculated that if these people had been encouraged to take surface transportation rather than flying, it would have made a pretty modest saving of around 1% of the total carbon footprint of conference delegates. So I guess the key point arising from this part of the analysis is that where we do have regional conferences that may be hosted in locations that are well served by surface transportation, and particularly rail networks in Europe, for example, or in parts of Asia, there will be savings made, but there are real limitations as to how much CO2 can be saved by encouraging those relatively nearby delegates by travelling by surface transportation. So Milan led the analysis that looked into various scenarios. One was to move the conference from San Francisco to a different host city in North America. And you can see here that the analysis indicated that if the AGU had been hosted in Washington, DC, then perhaps an 8% saving of carbon could have been achieved. The optimum location, saving 12% of CO2, was Chicago. But again, at the other end of the spectrum, if the conference was to be hosted somewhere like Honolulu, the total emissions would have increased by 42%, because obviously everyone, so to speak, would have had to have flown 4,000 kilometers or more to get to a conference hosted in Hawaii, which is important for people in places like New Zealand, because we are obviously similar to Hawaii when we host conferences here. People have to fly a very long way to get here, or at least the vast majority of delegates do for an international conference. We thought about how we could reimagine conferences and what other measures might be available to reduce the carbon footprint of these sorts of conferences. I've mentioned choosing accessible venues, which requires modelling delegates' journeys and gaining insights into what the carbon footprint might look like for conferences hosted in different host cities. And of course, encouraging low carbon transportation modes wherever possible. And you can see here, as mentioned, Washington, DC and Chicago. The other measure, obviously, is to increase virtual attendance, which has been part of the conversation for some time, pre-COVID, certainly. But COVID-19 has obviously had enormous implications for the hosting of conferences. So obviously increasing virtual attendance can help to reduce carbon emissions. We calculated that if 17% of those who travelled furthest to attend a conference were to do so virtually rather than in person, then a 39% saving could be achieved. But obviously this needs to be very carefully considered in terms of how we host conferences virtually in ways that allow people not only to present their work, but also to interact and to network and to socialize. And we're all obviously acutely aware of the benefits that can be achieved by those social and networking opportunities at conferences. So that's obviously an important question. There are also questions around registration costs for physical attendance as opposed to virtual as opposed to physical. And then, of course, the other measure is to become biennial and not to host conferences annually, but rather do so every other year, which, as you can see, immediately reduces the carbon footprint by 50%. And our thinking here extended to not simply hosting conferences every second year, but perhaps making the other years open to virtual conference attendance to try and develop and build a new virtual conference convention, if you like, so that by hosting online conferences in alternate years, we can build that momentum that we do need to build to encourage people to participate virtually and to interact in new ways. Then, of course, there's the question of combining these various steps and what the implications may be for the travel-related carbon emissions. Was quite dramatic when you start combining these initiatives. So, you know, by being biennial and virtual for a large proportion of delegates, or in fact being fully virtual, which has some of a carbon footprint, but obviously a minimal carbon footprint for fully virtual conferences, by way of which emissions could be almost completely eliminated. So here's the figure that appears in the paper, looking at different scenarios. from moving host cities to try and reduce emissions, through to a proportion of delegates attending virtually, particularly those with the disproportionately high carbon footprints, biennial conferences and fully virtual conferences in alternate years. Some great ways of thinking about how we can reduce that carbon footprint. Of course, there are downsides to a new model like this, and a big part of our development of the paper was thinking about those downsides and responding to potential concerns arising from a radically different conference convention. Obviously, there are benefits derived from attending conferences in person, and the idea of having conferences hosted in particular cities, and for many people therefore attending virtually only, may potentially create a two-tier conferencing system where some are continually disadvantaged by being distant from and therefore only attending virtually conferences that are located predominantly in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously, which also conflicts with our aspirations to be well connected globally and part of a global scientific community. So from this arose thoughts around the development of a hub-based model, and in the paper we refer to the 3-hub model, which Miles advanced in our discussions. Having said that, a 3-hub global model can also be deployed in variations at all scales of analysis, whether it's regionally or within a particular country like New Zealand. So we can think about this approach at different scales of analysis. So the thinking behind the 3-hub model is that we need to address particularly the super long haul emissions associated with attending conferences, but we want to do so in a way that hopefully can allow people to still interact face to face and network, and to do so in a way that hopefully can maintain aspects of equity in access to these sorts of conferencing opportunities. So the idea here was to combine different science conferences taking place in different continents, different parts of the world, combining those into a World Geosciences Union in this particular case. And you can see on this slide the sorts of ideas that flow from this 3-hub model approach. The idea here is that the conference would take place simultaneously. So these conferences that take place at different times of year and on different continents would be scheduled to coincide. They would be based from 3 hub locations and linked by dedicated virtual facilities that allow people to present their work, but hopefully also to interact and participate in networking and social activities. There's a challenge there to develop those sorts of opportunities for virtual participants. The idea is that attendees, conference delegates, would travel to their nearest hub and interact with their peers and their colleagues at that hub face to face, but across hubs virtually. Our analysis indicated that Chicago, Tokyo, and Paris would be the most suitable host cities for these hubs, based on analysis of the 2019 conference delegation, and that this model would dramatically reduce the travel emissions associated with all 3 of these meetings and conferences. There may be, well, it's inevitable, I suppose, that when you radically change a conference convention, that there will be some historical inequities that will be addressed, and there will be others that will emerge and will need to be carefully managed. All 3 of these hubs are in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously, so there are questions around access for Southern Hemisphere academics, because traveling to the nearest hub for an academic in New Zealand would require travelling to East Asia. Of course, the 3 hub model, there may be variations, there may be 4 or 5 or 6 hub models that may be developed in future. But we do need to think about aspects of historical privilege and find ways of making sure that these historical privileges are not necessarily perpetuated and recreated in the new normal. Of course, fully virtual conferences provide more equity in this respect. And there have been some really interesting examples of conference organizers that have responded by necessity straight away to the COVID crisis by going fully online, and some others have chosen to postpone or cancel conferences, obviously, but some have become partially virtual. But those that have gone fully virtual at short notice provide some quite interesting insights into aspects of an emerging new normal. I can't remember the conference, but Milan was telling me that one of the conferences in Europe had a massive increase in registrations when it became virtual, and many of the new conference registrants were from countries that were historically excluded. So some interesting new opportunities to address historical inequalities. Obviously, virtual attendance might help young researchers to gain global exposure, overcoming some of the barriers of funding and other barriers, of course, physical distance, cost, time, other family commitments or otherwise, that may have been barriers under the old normal. But I guess these questions of equity are really critical, and as a new normal emerges, we're going to need to be very conscious of managing these sorts of new concerns that are likely to arise. Here's a quote from the paper, which links to this article from the Journal of Cleaner Production that we cite in the paper, that questions the link between air travel, academic air travel, and career success, professional progression, questioning that relationship. So the key point I want to make here is that COVID has, in many ways, forced upon us a new convention, but that new conference convention will not be perpetuated by default. There are enormous questions that we're confronting in all aspects of our lives at the moment as to whether in the post-COVID world, whenever that might emerge, whether we return to the old normal or if we find new ways of living our lives and conducting ourselves professionally. And with that in mind, I really want to conclude with a few comments about how we might make some very conscious decisions about embedding a new conference convention for the post-COVID future. And I kind of conclude here with 3 slides that recognize that different organizations, bodies, individuals need to be thinking about how we move forward from this point. Obviously, academic associations and professional bodies have a really important role to play in terms of supporting and encouraging virtual participation, the organization of conferences that take very careful account of carbon emissions and equity and inclusivity. So there are obviously things that can be done here by academic associations and conference bodies that should include immediately moving to biennial conferences where they don't already exist. I know some of the big conferences, big international conferences, the Marine Mammals Association, for example, has a biennial conference, but it does seem logical that if we're concerned about carbon emissions, we need meetings to be biennial and virtual in alternate years. Research funding bodies need to be thinking about this in terms of supporting research grants that give priority to virtual conference presentation, dissemination of research findings, and that consider carbon budgets as part of those applications. Our institutions need to be working on these fronts if we want to commit to a new normal, investing in virtual technologies and technical support, recognizing that virtual conference attendance is very similar in many ways to traveling to and attending face-to-face in terms of time commitments. There will be time zone challenges. Obviously, there'll be needs for flexibilities around attending sessions online. We need our promotion and PBRF and other processes to recognise the new importance of virtual contributions. So institutions need to be thinking about these things. As researchers, we need to be committing if we're interested in tackling this problem. We need to be committed to promoting and supporting and attending virtual meetings and insisting that our conferences make opportunities available for people to present and attend virtually. And you know, I think senior academics have a role modelling role to perform here in terms of, you know, presenting invited keynotes virtually and insisting that that be the case. I've had lots of conversations with colleagues who have requested and been declined the opportunity to present keynotes virtually rather than travelling vast distances from New Zealand to attend conferences briefly, present keynotes and then travel all the way home. We need to be quite insistent about this as part of the new normal. And conference organisers, we need to be modelling emissions when selecting host cities. We need to be creating hubs and connecting effectively people virtually to eliminate the long-haul flights that account for such a high proportion of those emissions.
Yes, that was from Pre-Rides Morning.
And we need to be doing so not only for global conferences, international conferences, but at different scales as well, to accommodate people to take up this opportunity. And we need to be working with technology providers to really push the boundaries in terms of the current limitations and constraints around meaningful personal interactions, socializing and networking interactions in the virtual world. So we need to be pushing forward in this sense as well. So to conclude, it will only be through a concerted and coordinated effort that we might move towards a new model in this way. And I think one of the things that COVID has really highlighted is that we can change. We can change very quickly when the need arises. It's been demonstrated beyond doubt in recent weeks and months. And I just want to finish with this slide, which is a snapshot from a Twitter comment. The paper went viral on Twitter after it was published, and I really liked this contribution because it highlights how things have changed in terms of our mindset. Pre-COVID, the attitude really was virtual doesn't really work. You know, it's a nice idea and in principle, but it's not really effective. And then during the COVID crisis, as conferences were put online and many people began to attend conferences online, the attitude was kind of, wow, this brings so many benefits. And yes, it actually does work. Whoops, we didn't really think about this previously, but it does actually work. And then post-COVID, whenever that may be, how dare we to have exchanged knowledge in such unsustainable and non-inclusive ways in the past? So this is the slide that I promised at the start, because it really does speak to Michael's comment at the very start of the hour, how things have changed, and much of what has changed in our heads and the way we think about these things. So lots to think about in terms of pathways forward from this point. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James. That was kind of perfect for our seminar series. Didn't realise what you were going to talk about before you started, but that fit really, really well. So we now have a chance for questions from the floor. If you, I mean, you can either just unmute yourself and start talking, or you could put up your hand and I will select you. If anyone has a burning question, you can get in quick right now. Well, I might start then, James. So I was just thinking about some of these other benefits that you were talking about. I guess the sort of co-benefits of enabling less wealthy, students or less wealthy countries to participate more in these international conferences. Were you able to quantify that, or I guess gauge what sort of benefits might arise from that, and what countries might benefit?
No, not specifically, Michael, but we were very conscious of the fact that such a significant shift in conference convention would create new opportunities. I mentioned conferences going online in the eye of the COVID storm, and finding that numbers of registrations went up significantly, and that many of those registrations were from delegates that were previously excluded. So, some quite exciting opportunities really to create far more inclusive conferences, to think about barriers, historical barriers, historical exclusions, and how we can create conference opportunities that are far more open and less exclusive than in the past. And there may be mechanisms or levers that can be applied to this. So, for example, I'd imagine that registration costs for virtual participants would be reduced compared to those who attend in person. But through those registration costs, there may be opportunities to provide funding for people to engage, to potentially participate, to travel to their nearest hub, to be actively accommodated to allow their participation. The new model that the 3-hub model does obviously create potential new inequalities. If conferences are routinely hosted in a city like Chicago, or Tokyo, Paris, Vienna, wherever, then obviously people with immediate proximity will be advantaged by being able to attend in person routinely. So yeah, we do need to think very carefully about those sorts of perhaps emerging inequalities. But I think the opportunities to address historical inequalities are quite exciting.
Great. So yeah, I've just been informed that my my sound wasn't very good just before. So just opening up the floor for anyone to ask questions. The chat is also available. I think, Nancy, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question, make a couple of suggestions. Thank you, James. That's really, really thought-provoking. A couple of things. It would be interesting to see some further analysis of, I would really favor a 5-hub model with, maybe South America and Africa being included in the discussion from the get-go, because otherwise I think your point about continuing inequities it's just inevitable for that to be a problem. It seems like your 5-hub or your 3-hub model still would allow a lot of the personal interaction that to me is so important at a conference. For me, in my own circumstance, 2 particular conferences have totally changed the trajectory of my life and my career. And one was an opportunity to take up a postdoc in Australia, which I never would have had if I hadn't gone to this particular conference. And the other one was going to a science communication conference in Melbourne and discovering that there was such a thing. And again, changed my career. So, so I am a bit of a fan of conferences. The analysis that I'd like to suggest is when people sign up for virtual conferences, you get so you said you had an increase, you noted an increase in registrations. It would be interesting to see how many people who register really make the effort to go, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because if you've flown all the way, you've made a commitment and you're going to go. But if you've registered for something online and something else comes up and blah, 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 it'd be interesting to note actual participation.
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. Really good comments. I totally agree with the idea of the 5-hub model. I guess the key point that I want to emphasize is that the 3-hub model can be adapted, and you know, if the modeling of carbon emissions suggests the need for additional hubs, in our analysis, a 4th hub would probably have been in South Asia. But a 5th hub, different hubs in different continents, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. I mean, I think that the key point here is that hubs can be created as determined by the specifics of a particular conference and the delegation. So I totally agree with that. In terms of personal interaction, your other comment, I agree. I can single out one conference that I attended in 2005 that I'm still deriving benefits from 15 years later, but particularly in the 5 or 6 years after that conference, it really set my research trajectory with a particular direction, with particular collaborations that wouldn't have occurred without that conference. So I'm not, we're not suggesting here that that this model will necessarily do away with the face-to-face important networking and socializing opportunities of conferences. But what I do foresee is traveling less frequently to conferences and far more selectively than what I've experienced and seen in the past. So that rather than having an annual conference, 2 conferences, 3 conferences a year, all involving significant air travel, we move progressively towards a more RSL-like model where we plan for our trips well in advance and we travel less frequently for longer periods of time to attend conferences amongst all other things that we might do on RSL, so that we still have those opportunities to network and interact face-to-face when they arise. This, of course, also raises questions about career stage. I derived enormous benefits from conferences, particularly in the earlier years of my career, and I certainly don't want to deny early career colleagues those same opportunities. So, you know, it may be that we move towards a model where the more established researchers have particular conference needs and the early career researchers are accommodated slightly differently. But again, lots of things to be thinking about.
So Janet, you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure how to indicate apart from that, but yeah, if that's okay.
Yep, sure.
Yeah. So thank you, James. That was really thought-provoking, and I love the degree of analysis that's been done to give us those insights. It was really, really impressive. And I guess, I mean, one thing it makes me think about is that we have to rethink what it means to be internationally networked as academics, and to think about that in more critical ways, and what represents our level of international networking, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean being in place. And I guess added to that is a slight cynicism that I often, or from time to time, hear from academics, like this kind of throw-off line, like I'm going to that conference because it's a lovely place and I want to enjoy the beaches, or it's a really great city and I'm going to go and explore it culturally. So there's, for a lot of academics, part of going to a conference is those social add-ons or those cultural add-ons, and is that an appropriate thing that we should be doing? And certainly this makes us look at those things in a very critical way. But where I kind of wanted to get to actually was really that this analysis you've done actually sort of points to the need to kind of further services for conference organisers, and one is some kind of applicational model where they can say, put in a whole lot of data about who are our audience, where are they located, and what might be the best mix of regional locations and virtual offerings that would best minimise the greenhouse gas emissions for this particular type of conference. So I can almost see an app emerging where you can put in some data and it would spit out, you know, various options and the relative greenhouse gases. And the other one is we've seen how quickly virtual interaction via Zoom has taken off. But what I'm thinking is there a further step whereby we can even increase further the quality of virtual interactions online, so that it feels even more like being in the same room than it does already? And that's another huge research area I know that's occurring globally, but this really pushes it further and the need for it even further.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. They're really awesome comments. Yes, rethinking how we function internationally, how we work internationally, how we network internationally. I think that's great. We do need to be thinking about that, and I think that there are emerging new opportunities to network internationally that we perhaps have thought about, should have thought about more, but perhaps haven't advanced as much as we would otherwise have done in the absence of COVID. I do think that how we network internationally, how we demonstrate internationalization and international standing needs to be accommodated in promotion processes. I know, for example, also beyond promotion, that in the PBRF process, you know, to be an A, you need to be international, of international standing. Well, how do we define that? You know, how does someone who doesn't want to travel internationally or refuses to travel internationally as much as perhaps in the past, how does someone demonstrate that international standing? We need to think about that really carefully in terms of promotion and research assessment and such like. Definitely agree about the app and the idea of a simple functionality to model conferences in terms of host venues to reduce carbon emissions, and locations of hubs to minimize air travel to attend at those hubs. This was actually a comment that was raised by the handling editor for the paper, asking exactly these sorts of questions, where we said, you know, it's going to be necessary to model the carbon footprint of conference delegations. The response was, how do we actually do that? You know, unless we have quite specialist skills. So that's a really nice idea. And finally, Zoom and the next steps. This is a really, really important point. We do need to, I mentioned technology providers, and I do think that we're on the cusp of some exciting new potential opportunities in terms of virtual presence, mobile technologies, and how we can facilitate virtual attendance and how we can facilitate virtual conference attendance that extends to meaningful interactions, where we have social and networking opportunities that people who are present can engage in with people who are virtually present. There are emerging opportunities there that we need to follow up very in a very determined manner, because that will be critical to the new model that we've proposed. Thanks for your comments, Janet.
Yeah, I think it also brings to mind, you know, the way the younger generation interacts virtually already, and there seems to be, you know, a number of lessons we maybe already can derive from the way they're interacting, and that new wave of researchers, younger researchers, may be much more open to kind of virtual interaction as well. So there is a question here from Rajan. Would you like to speak to your question in the chat, Rajan?
Yep. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. It was really good presentation. So I'm just confused, like, okay, I would prefer to go virtual conference, considering the environmental aspects. But at the same time, what I feel like, face-to-face conference will help, like, like me as a early career researcher. I feel like it is more fruitful for me, like to have face-to-face connection with the expert professionals in my field, which will help me to build my career or seeking new opportunities in future. So, okay, if like we go to virtual conferences and people don't attend, like the professionals, like expert professionals don't get involved into the conference, then how we'll be connected? At the same time, if we go to like in-person conferences, just the early career researcher present their presentation, but the expert professional doesn't come into the conference, then how, like, both audience will be connected, like the early career researcher and the expert professional?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Again, a really important question, Rajan. And I don't know. I don't know the answers. I totally agree that there are some aspects of attending conferences that are virtually impossible to replicate. And I'm not saying that, as I've mentioned, that virtual conferences should ultimately replace face-to-face engagements at conferences. I do think that, and I've mentioned already, that for early career people, these sorts of opportunities are particularly critical. I think that reflecting upon my own career in the last 15 years or more, the benefits that I've derived from being in attendance at a conference in person have reduced over time. I have established collaborations. I know people in my field well. I don't need to necessarily travel to meet them. I can interact with them perfectly well via email and Zoom and other mechanisms. I have actually experimented in the past with virtual collaborations with people who I've never met before, and I found that those also are possible without the need for traveling to and meeting face-to-face with collaborators. So there are amazing opportunities that I think we need to be open-minded about and willing to explore. But I certainly hear your concern, and I share it, particularly on behalf of early career colleagues who I want to see have those sorts of opportunities now and in the future. So I don't have answers. I agree with much of what you're saying. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've kind of got 10 minutes to go before the hour. So I think I might bring the talk to a close now. James, you have to be somewhere. So I'd just like to finally thank you very much for that really stimulating talk. It was kind of bang on for our series. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for the opportunity. We certainly live in very, very interesting times.
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay. This talk will be recorded, and if you want to sign up for OERC, please you can send your email details to me or to the administrator. She'll add you to the mailing list. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.